Right.
Okay. Pulling up the agenda, we'll call this meeting to order. Okay, does anybody want to read the planning commission land acknowledgement?
I can do it. We'd like to acknowledge we are on the traditional land of a rich and diverse group of native peoples who call this area home for more than 10,000 years. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the descendants of these native peoples who are still here today. In doing this, we aim to illuminate the longer history of this land we call home, our relationship to this history, and the heritage of those peoples whose ancestors lived here before the European American immigration that began in the 1800s.
Great, thank you. Okay, and everybody got the agenda that was sent on Friday? That's it, we'll have it in front of you. Perfect. Are there any edits to the agenda, or does anyone want to make a motion to approve it?
I make a motion to approve the agenda. Yes. Would I second it?
Party on. That's the technical term, right? Okay, great. Looks like, so our next meeting date is going to be July 11th. Is that people have a quorum, or does anybody have any conflicts with that date?
I may have conflict.
Yeah,
as well.
I'll be on the test.
Okay. I also may have to do virtually. We're okay.
Okay, yes, well, just, as we get closer, we'll figure out. Yeah, we can also move the date around, if needed.
What is that date again?
July 11th.
Oh, thank you. It's on the 12th, so I just.
It's always tough, so much time.
When you're wrong. Yeah. I think at this time, we'll see if there's any citizen comments. Do we have anybody on?
You I haven't joined the meeting. But
Oh,
you joined the meeting?
No, I'm not on there yet.
Okay, but it looks like there's only one participant,
Yeah.
which would be a
Us.
screen up there.
Yeah,
So, if we have any- but, could you just check, Nick, while I
yeah,
get it going, just in case
yeah.
it's
It's us.
not counting itself, it might be counting.
That's us.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Cool.
All right.
Okay, Councilmember Bodie, I think you have a lot to talk about, right?
Yeah.
I missed you last week.
I've been away a lot of the month of May, so, but I will tell you, this, which is that the council has been working on ordinance for retaining walls in the city, large and small. And so, and Director Bennett's been very involved in that effort. And we adopted an interim emergency retaining wall ordinance last week, just in case we had an application.
In case you have one, sorry.
An application coming in. So, but we are having, we did have one public hearing on it, on the retaining wall ordinance already. We have made some changes and we're considering some additional changes involving noise impacts and noise mitigation. But we wanted to collect some more information, so we will be having an additional public hearing on it before we adopt the final version on June 22nd. And we also have been discussing modifications to the tree ordinance to allow kind of a corridor type approach to tree impacts and mitigation. And though we don't know what form our the application will take that we will get in from Sound Transit, for example. But we made some updates and those will also be subject of the public hearing on June 22nd. So if you want to, but I would encourage, if you have comments on either of those, that you make a report from June 22nd in advance so we can take them into account. So that's the good news there. And I keep pushing for making a final decision on the reasonable use exception ordinance that you all recommended, and the council actually had some discussions and recommended some clarifications, improvements, additions, including discussing the issue of size limitations, or a kind of a standard guideline for size limitations, let's put it that way. That would be less than the 1250 or so that our hearing examiner sometimes lands on. So that will come up soon. I've been talking to the mayor and the deputy mayor about getting that back on the agenda so we can wrap it up, because the longer you wait in between discussions, you know, the more you start over that philosophy. So that's something. And then several months back, but it bumped for lack of priority, I also recommended that we take up the idea of a permit process for residential parking. In light of the park and Sound Transit, if a neighborhood, you know, 60, I think it was set up so if 60% of the people in a neighborhood wanted to petition for a residential parking system, they could. You would have to pay for a permit. It could apply only at certain times of day. It doesn't have to be all the time. And the council had a good discussion, and but we weren't able, just with the press of other business, like we had our council meeting until 10:30 last night. I mean Thursday night. 6 to 10:30. Wow, really. We were really alert at the very end. Anyway, so that's another item that is needs to be brushed off and picked up, but that I think the reasonable use exception ordinance will go before that. So I'll keep you posted and make sure that Steve lets you all know when that's scheduled for additional council discussion. But I've kept those on my plate for reminding people that we shouldn't drop the ball on this too. So that's it. Any questions?
Are they expecting a 5% during sort of the morning?
Hopefully not. I mean, that's partly the goal, is to represent what we want in ways that are smart. So that we don't have a fight, and we've been trying to keep the lines of communication open. What's kind of interesting is it's a 3-part conversation, because Sound Transit has to get permits from us, but they also have to get approval from WashDOT, which is, you know, the preeminent wall and road organization, and has their own standards. So it's confusing, because you would think it would be a 3-part conversation, but it's a 2 and 2 conversation with Sound Transit at the hub. So I for one have recommended that we formally ask Sound Transit and WashDOT to share with us a draft of their agreement before they finalize it, so that we can provide any input that we have. But it's tough, you know, we have a small staff, and Sound Transit has limitless, highly paid staff. Almost limitless compared to us. Anyway, so yes, we expect that sometime in the near future we'll be getting permit applications. Is that safe to say, Steve?
I think so. Yeah, I think they're very
Yeah.
anxious to see what-
But the construction impacts on, you know, I do worry about the combination of Bothell Way and Ballinger both having construction impacts. You know, I don't know if any of you tried to drive on Ballinger when they were doing some work out there, but it was blocked, backed up like miles. So they weren't too good on the you know, the traffic coordination.
How soon is the traffic circle going in up there on? You know,
It isn't I don't think the traffic circle would be first, it would be the culvert, wouldn't it, Steve?
Yeah, I heard that the WashDOT part of the culvert project is being delayed. So
That's
I
again,
don't know.
yeah,
I mean, they're pretty far apart. I think,
Yeah.
You know, so
They-
it could be in the next couple of years, but we're pretty short staffed in terms of the project management on that. We've only got 1 out of 2 project manager positions filled. And so I think that might be slowing things down as well.
But we did get money to do our part of the culvert from the state legislature, if you haven't heard that. So after multiple years, we hire a lobbyist who works for us in other cities in the state legislature. And so it's kind of like an earmark, you know? And so, anyway, so that's good news. So I didn't hear that it had been further delayed. And
Yeah,
this is, in my whole time on council, the story of WashDOT's part, is delayed.
And you want to do, this is upstream from ours. So you want to do
Yeah.
that first.
Yeah,
So, see what
exactly,
happens.
exactly. So maybe Ballinger won't have any traffic. I thought they were doing surveys for that when they were out there, no?
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, okay, anyway. Stay tuned.
Has the lines of communication with Sound Transit been a little more open? I know we had concern before they had that hearing, and I was able to attend the hearing, but
Yeah.
they've been open and receptive to any of the concerns we had about the impact of the.
They're open in the sense that they meet with us. I think we've been having, my understanding, speaking only for myself, is that we have been having difficulty getting them to confirm things in writing. And so it may, there's a process of coordination, but how far they're going in addressing our concerns is unclear. Oh, so one other additional thing, Councilmember Cassover was at a transportation forum meeting, and the CEO of Sound Transit happened to be there. And so she said she would speak bluntly and talk about what her priorities were. And so Philip apparently said she would speak bluntly and say that the coordination with Lake Forest Park wasn't that good. And so she is coming to a council meeting on a date to be determined, but supposedly fairly soon. So I bet there'll be sideboards on that meeting, because otherwise she could be here for a few hours. But anyway, the fact that she's coming is good, because when the project team has come to public meetings, it's very much talking, not listening. And assuring that all mitigation will be good. If you ever look at the SEBA documents, kind of like that, yes, no, there will be no noise impacts. So again, I'm expressing my personal views, not the views of the city of Lake Forest Park, just to be clear.
Well,
I have not.
there was a good presentation from our staff of, kind of what I
Yeah.
think the walls might look like.
Yes, there is a PowerPoint, if you want to look at it, from the last council meeting, showing what we are trying to get the walls to look like. So we want an embossed tree design on it. We want vine pockets, which may have to be, taken very good care of to make sure the vines actually grow up. I think the ongoing discussion at the council meeting was, what about noise? Because the concern is, if you have a really tall wall on one side, and there are pictures of what the wall would look like too, which you might enjoy, with a kind of a Trex type fence on the top, as opposed to a black chain link fence. So that's good. And we're hoping that we have agreement and understanding on those, but there's no written confirmation. So, but the part of the concern is, if you have a big wall and there's only a little bit of vines on it, and there's not any greenery on that side of the wall, the reflected noise back to the other side of the street is going to be high, and the noise is coming closer to people's front and back doors, and that wasn't the vegetation removal wasn't taken into account when Sound Transit did its assessment, and they didn't really address the proximity to people's front and back doors. So there's a lot to be done there, but we don't, to be honest, we don't know where that topic will go, the noise mitigation. Sorry if it was too much.
No, it's not at all. They're really valuable.
I can show you a few of the slides from the
Oh,
presentation.
thank you, that's good.
So, But, but Jeff Perrigo, the Public Works Director, did this. And so he just took like a Google Maps version of where the render was, and then he shows year one, what it would look like. And then
Well,
Year
and east
5.
means north for me, just so you know. And they call it east-west because it goes all the way around the top of it.
right, yeah, so you're looking at the lake is on your right,
Right.
and then from 57.
But you can see how tall the wall is in relation to the bus.
Mhm.
Right. And the people.
Yeah.
Which changes in year 5 there, because there's not a median for trees. And this is looking on the upland side, the lake is to your left, and some places the wall's gonna shrink down to just sort of a barrier to keep vehicles from going into people's backyards. Year 5.
Is it sitting down, allow people to raise their walls above the 6 foot?
Well, so you can kind of see that this is these two, the fence and the wall here those are sound transit improvements. And behind that, they can still have their own fence and back there.
Okay.
So there'll be just like I don't know, 2 or 3 foot easement.
Or you don't have to, and then you just have to give the city an easement to come on and check the drains.
Okay.
So there's,
Yeah.
I think that was at least the 2 approaches.
Right, that was part of the deal, was that
Yeah.
washed out, initially they wanted this wide sort of like prison perimeter, they could just drive between the private fence and the public fence and check on everything whenever they wanted. So, the city offered, we'll check on that stuff for you, we'll do the maintenance.
Yeah, they're used to like I-5 kind of. I think that had to have so many residential properties along a major transit route like this is really not the norm for either Sound Transit or West Valley.
Yes, it's definitely an unusual situation.
Yeah.
So, great,
Thank
anything
you.
else? Or-
No, that was it. Thank you. Hope it's helpful.
So when do we need to go back and approve the minutes?
Oh, it's the,
Into the,
yeah.
workshop?
Did everybody get a chance to read through the minutes? Yeah, okay, great. Any changes, or if not, is there a motion to approve?
I move to approve the minutes.
I second.
Oh, yeah, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that update. So old business, we want to talk about the comprehensive plan update. I think most everyone was a part of our meeting last month, and that was when we decided that were we gonna take the month off and prepare for this comprehensive plan, or do we really want to lean in and figure out some real big points of emphasis based on the subdivisions of the comprehensive plan? And so we opted to do the second, which was spend some time. Everyone sent to Director Bennett the recaps of the top priorities for each of the boards that we have. And did everybody get a chance to take a look at those? Yeah. So I think what we wanted to spend the majority of today was to really vision board this, if you will, and put what the top priorities are, with the idea being that this is going to be our guiding principle as we go into meeting with the consultant. And so we know what are the target areas in which we want to really dig into. And so unless you have a different idea, do we want to hear just a high level couple bullet points from each representative of the notes? We're actually missing a couple folks, so maybe that doesn't work.
Well, why don't we just, if we could just start with the Climate Action Committee, and I think Lois got kind of a good idea of what we want to do. So if you want to just hit the high points that you think, what you think were the most important things that that committee would see, going into the plan, and we'll just figure out kind of how do we summarize that over here. I can do the writing, and then we'll think about, what elements we've created these posted, so we can kind of just, put a note, this probably is going to affect the housing element, this might affect the land use element as well. So what would you say kind of the top three things, Lois, from the climate action committee?
The main one I saw was transportation, and that's why I kind of highlighted transportation in my note, just kind of the background. In January of this year, I guess Washington State passed the climate, the greenhouse, the climate reduction act, or the greenhouse reduction act. And so that's kind of triggered us as part of, being Washington State to come up with this climate action plan. The group was formed to then come up with a draft plan for the council to approve as to how they are going to be compliant with this new legislation. And they sent out a survey last December. I don't know if everyone got a chance to fill that out. So the survey results were in to kind of survey what the community felt was their top priority in terms of climate change. And they summarized that in their February meeting. And then the last few months has been working with, basically using the city of Kenmore and Shoreline as templates in order to come up with the draft plan. And out of it, they've gotten the basic bones of it structured and just did really well. It's almost ready to present to the council. And in terms of the comp plan, the main thing that I saw was the transportation element. And I'll just go to that real quick. I would have been more detailed than these. So the main thing with the transportation component that came out of it was really trying to get net zero, try to get as many electrical vehicles within the city of Lake Forest Park. And I think they had this half jokingly 2025 have everybody in electrical vehicles. Some of the zoning challenges that we see for that though is there's no infrastructure to support electric vehicles, EVs, and where to charge and charging stations, that sort of thing. So if zoning building codes could actually have more kind of modern ways of facilitating that. Also charging stations, I guess it's a real thing to when you own an EV, there's an anxiety as to where you're going to charge next. And so to have more charging stations available. And so that touches kind of on infrastructure as well, like the capital facilities too. But so that was one of the main components. The built environment was another component that they had addressed for, how could, especially in terms of our facilities, how we could be more green and just move away from kind of gas powered energy sources and also insulate, so, ways that we could be innovative in promoting building codes such that, the houses are better insulated and more efficient. And then the other one that I thought was relevant to us was the municipal operations, kind of also looking at, moving more towards electric vehicles for the city. And then, of course, the natural environment, how we can continue to conserve, develop, and support the natural environment. And then, I think those were the main ones that I saw relevant to the comp plan.
What was the last one?
The natural environment. There were other elements, but I didn't see so much crossover with the comp plan as much. But perhaps you commissioners may once you.
Well, just before we open it up, when you say natural environment, are they talking about just promotion of like tree canopy or
Exactly looking
vegetative mitigation of
develop
warming through lots of readers.
right. Well, making sure they were looking at the stream buffers, for example. We have, I guess, a couple of streams that that runs the city. So how can we preserve, restore the natural environment along with, so it's more resilient towards, possible warming effects. They were looking at preserving tree canopy. That was a big one. Making sure that the canopy is preserved in order for, offsetting some of the warming. You had mentioned a good thing, but that didn't come up, which was, I'm kind of going off on a tangent, but how we could maybe look at alternative species too, but does that answer your question? There was I think it was Richard Saunders' brother, Ryan Saunders. He had referenced some sort of King County study that was looking at the riparian zone. This is beyond my expertise, but there was something that he was referencing, some sort of riparian zone study as a model of how we could, what are the ideal kind of zones that we want along streams and how we can promote that.
Great. Yeah, so that, when the more you elaborated was, the more elements I started thinking about, where that, clearly, reducing greenhouse gases, that's transportation. Who's got transportation? And thank you. And so, but you can also do a lot with your land use element to reduce the need for trips, right? So does everybody agree that that's probably something we not only find ways to encourage parking stations, but also have commercial walkable pathways between gathering areas like commercial zones and parks and residential areas. So that's kind of what I was thinking, like, that as you're thinking about sort of what we're going to learn from Parks and Rec, think about sort of how do these things sum up in a way where we see this kind of cross the spectrum of all the elements that we have in the comp plan, and sort of build on what those are and determine, does community service really represent kind of a category that still makes sense? Because it's not, none of that is set in stone. We can tinker around with the way the comp plan is organized by moving some things together or separating some things out. Like maybe community service wants to be a couple of different things, public safety and something else. So that hopefully that's what kind of comes out of this exercise, is that we're kind of thinking about the overall organization, what we're hearing internally in the city. When I say internally, I just mean like advisory boards and staff, so that what we're trying to do here is kind of aid our consultants, and they'll have sort of a roadmap. Okay, well here's what's coming from all these different entities. So they just hit the ground running on their public engagement. They're talking to people. So along the same line, charging stations, got to have U20 voltage. Obviously, for the fast station, what's the charge that my son and daughter want to have them? And they're just constantly planning their life around a fast charger. Because the rest of them are just like, might as well get a hotel room. It takes so much to charge the car. Another land use for green, green construction. Any other ideas? Yes.
Charging stations also be capital facilities?
Yeah.
Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
definitely. I almost put capital facilities and utilities on the same, this got capital facilities. On the same poster, because usually you do it with one, you do it with the other, but there could be some differences.
The other thing that came out, the multi-fam, there was kind of like that missing middle component to the climate change. There's that, the multifamily residential zones, they don't have, a way to even support EVs. It was an issue that, so I don't know if that touches on like housing or land use, but
Yeah, that's kind of a land use issue.
mentioned that.
We can have, there's always a land use issue for a charging or something like that. Because you have to, the zoning has to allow for charging stations to be built. This area, so. Yeah. So what about preserving tree canopy, enhancing riparian zones?
Probably environmental.
Environmental quality.
So yes, and I would also say economic development. Because what people are looking for is quality of life.
Mhm.
And, more and more, we're going to be looking for communities where it's impacted by, sure, a pleasant environment or an environment that where there are trees.
I think we probably also have environmental quality for green construction. We do cover that in the plan currently under environmental quality.
Yeah, sure.
And maybe even also the emissions one.
No, it's already up there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you're gonna have to write it on.
So no one for emissions,
Emissions?
emissions for environmental quality, the.
Perhaps.
Emissions.
So
Or we
emissions,
cover
yeah.
air quality in the environmental stuff.
Yeah, because, more vegetation, you have more filtering air. So that's a pretty good start there. Anybody else what they want to put up?
So in your notes, it said something about recycling and composting. Was that more on a residential basis, or like was there like a municipal kind of need there as well?
Yeah, there was a big discussion because of the plastic, like they went off on plastics because there's a. But yes, how can we involve the community more so that we raise the awareness for plastic recycling? I guess plastics aren't recyclable, which I didn't know. There was this whole thing with plastics, but how can we have more community events, have big recycling events for the city and raise the community's awareness of that, and then basic services in order to promote more composting and that sort of thing. Something that was interesting was this is kind of on the side. I guess I was surprised that they were talking about also reducing greenhouse gases through the use of reducing gardening tools, gas powered gardening tools. I didn't realize it was such a big.
lawnmowers.
Yeah, I don't, those
Leaf
blowers.
Those blowers, the lawnmowers, yeah. Two-stroke engines are not
Yeah.
very
Yeah,
clean.
Right, they're burning oil and.
I
fuel.
own all of those. things. I was just.
All right, well.
I know.
You can ask for Christmas and Tuesday and next.
But it was- Yeah, but it was down, I mean, there was so much discussed that, I fear that I may not be, there's some things that might be missed, so. But, there is a nice draft plan that, has been, is on the works.
Great, okay, well, why don't we, move forward, we can always come back. So who would like to summarize, Parks and Recreation Board? Yeah, we've got a printout too. Yeah.
You want the print up?
Oh,
So the current projects focus that they're looking at, or are we looking at future? Do we wanna
Well, it just.
quickly go over like the
You can just
current?
kind of, talk about what they said, and then we'll figure out how we summarize it.
Okay, well, looks like they talked about in the last one, pickleball project. Where they purchased pickleball nets and painted pickleball courts in the tennis courts at Horizon View Park.
Mhm.
Current projects, the lakefront park property project. They're seeking a consultant to initiate the lakefront parks planning phase. And then they'll begin public outreach to get, I guess, input from that. Yoga in the parks, last year yoga in the parks was a huge success, 6 weeks at Animal Acres Park. With different instructors, 40-60 people, like that was popular. Eric Zhang is a high school member of the advisory board, so they brought in a high school student. Creating walking map. That connects various parks. Provide guided or self-directed walking routes with educational materials about trees and birds of Lake Forest Park. Who actually attended this?
I think it was Meredith.
Was it Meredith? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I'd love to see that.
And she, of course, she is way beyond, she's already given us policy numbers.
Oh, yeah. Future projects, multicultural events, bike racks in all parks. But those are the 2 future projects that they have on here. Other groups involved in the Park and Recreation Committee, let's see, the Lake Forest Park Stewardship Foundation. Recovering Kokanee. In the clear and Leon Creeks, is Kokanee, is that,
I'm so sorry.
what is Kokanee?
That's a type of fish.
Oh, okay, all right.
They're small landlocked sockeye.
Oh, okay.
I was thinking fair.
That's what it comes from.
Restoration of 5-acre woods and Graceful Natural Park, stream keepers, salmon in schools. Impacts of habitat and urbanization, avian biodiversity and behavior. And then also Lake Forest Park Maintenance Department was involved in this, park maintenance, surface water, operations and maintenance, and streets.
That's probably hard.
Yeah,
Meredith, it looks like she's already got all the topics that touch the. So like the park trails, parks and trails. Community services, yeah.
Yeah, she's gone for the extra credit. But let's just kind of think about I think the most beneficial thing is helping all of you just, I think, across these elements. That's really, and I see it, and I'm sure there's other things that are going to come out of this way. But, you know, whenever we think about, you know, policies related to new parks or existing parks, you know, obviously it's the parks and trails element, but it's also capital facilities. So all those capital facilities need to be thought, they're going to have to be prioritized along with whatever transportation. City's got so much money you can work with, you get specialized grants, but you know, every time you add a new park, you're adding something to that capital facilities budget that is going to push something else down. So that's why I think it's useful to think about that. And so so I was just kind of covering this. We've got the new parks, we've got new facilities, existing parks. So that kind of 5-acre woods it's sort of already open, but it needs to be further developed. Whereas the Lakefront Park is not open yet. So kind of thinking about rolling some of those other things up, what else would you say that where you kind of or any of you that kind of rises up to, you know, multicultural events or I think you know, that's sort of different. How do you address that with companies? So it seems like that's kind of a community service.
same with the walking routes.
That'd be transportation, that'd be part of transportation.
Yeah, transportation and the
Yeah.
educational materials around the walking routes.
And,
And the yoga is community service. So, like that was popular, the yoga in the park.
yeah.
There could also end up being community meeting space. in the lakefront properties, because there's a couple of buildings that are probably routine.
I'm sorry, go ahead. How do we think of, for the other groups, I think some of that may need to be reflected as too, because the Stewardship Foundation, there's a couple pieces there about, kind of the riparian issues and then, impacts on, development and how you balance that with avian biodiversity. Like those are things that might fit into a comprehensive master plan on environmental quality.
Yeah.
Makes me think that maybe the consultant should do some outreach with the Stewardship Foundation as well.
They'll make themselves known.
It's when you least expect. it. Okay, yeah, that's good. Let's see, so who's got the part? Who's got the part? Yeah, give me a couple of those. And
Transportation. Community. Community services. Big whole lot. Frisbee policy.
It's better than the sticky dot.
Mystic skill and talent.
community services.
Yeah, we need these.
Some environment, awesome.
Environmental
Thank you.
quality.
Cute, yeah.
So if you want.
Environmental quality was the next one. I think, land use plays into it, but there's, you don't really, you want to create regulations that keep you from, usually you just kind of blow right through whatever the land use problem is, so you can build a park. Let's change the regulations, whatever. So we could say put something facilitating in land use if anybody think of an issue that crystallize. Yeah, so you and what else? Did I miss something? Oh, we want capital facilities on the new parks and new park facilities and all and existing parks, right? Just gonna go community. So here's capital facilities. This is good.
And also go on walking routes.
Yeah. So, and then I think, maybe, this, every park facility in the city is running into something. It's not like we've got, ball fields in the middle of, pastures. So it's always gonna be, you gotta really be thinking about that. And the, that's the kind of thing that I don't, when you write, like we did this last pros plan, which is, Parks Rec, recreational space and trails. And so, the push is really about the facilities. And so I think maybe that's where the comp plan can really come in, saying the facilities really need to be done in a sensitive manner, given, all of the other priorities. So I think that's important to think about that with any new facilities. Any other thoughts on?
Can I just raise a comment? So when it comes to parks and recreation, one of the latent issues is if we're gonna have water-based recreation dredging. Because the shoreline is silting in, and so the Civic Club has actually been starting the process to get a permit to dredge, so that the beach doesn't fill in. And so we would be adjacent to that, and so it would make some sense to have common policies for the privately owned and the publicly owned space. So it's a secondary issue. I just wanted to flag it while we were talking about environmental quality, because it's recreation over environment, natural environment in that particular case, but I think that is a place where it would be good to, hear a recommendation on how you strike that balance.
Yeah, actually, this, environmental quality element also ties into the shoreline, trend as well.
Yeah,
And so, we need to finish that update, the opportunity to sort of, create, something more, that fits what, we want to do in these parks, in
Right.
addition to what the, Civic Club wants to do.
Yeah.
Is to
I assume
tie to that.
Kenmore did something.
Yeah. we must have. We got that approved.
Yeah.
So, great.
Made a
okay.
beach.
All right.
Sandy Beach.
So, do you want to do this side?
Sure.
The summarizer? And,
Can I just add housing to climate action too? I think housing is.
yeah, do I have it?
The pink, yeah,
Yeah, definitely.
now that I'm understanding the answers.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is definitely housing.
Yeah.
And, so is.
Community services too for the recycling that Sam had mentioned too. I mean, climate action is all over the complex.
Yeah. Definitely.
Would
Community
you-
services, you're thinking down here.
I'm sure under at some point it'll pop up, yeah, because they talked about the recycling and the, and housing, and, yeah. Okay, thanks.
Do we want to put economic development under like multicultural and yoga events?
Sure. Okay, any more? All right, so, yeah, so I can, summarize, Meredith, I think,
Oh,
did
okay.
the police as well, right? Public safety. And unless anybody else feels like they kind of know where Meredith is coming from on that. I do work for that city. Okay, so the police, she talked with Police Chief Mike Harden, and the current needs are there's a need for 1 to 3 additional officers, and the current replacement of the fleet. There's no vehicle that's older than 5 years old. Prevent coverage gaps. The fleet is currently composed of so that no vehicle, the ideal fleet is no older than vehicles older than 5 years, but right now, current fleet is composed entirely of vehicles 5 years and older. So this is sort of a operational issue that, sometimes I think that's one of the I guess more puzzling things about comprehensive planning is that we, as a citizen, you kind of see this as a continuum, but in comprehensive planning, we're not really getting into the operational things like how do we afford more police cars or more staff. We're trying to figure out, what is sort of a broad-based policy that would kind of roll up into areas of emphasis for public safety and community service. So it's totally natural. Police Chief went here. It's he is a good steward for his organization. But the next bullet under current needs is one that long-term. This is where it feeds into some of the things. The 10-year plan to move the current fleet to hybrid or fully electrical vehicles is desired by the department. So that's probably something that we want to take note of there.
We're hoping for grants.
Yeah, right,
Yeah,
because we're talking about it in terms of the other
Right.
municipal operations, might be a shorthand there.
right.
And then the future needs, when you, and this is something that you have to think about when you add new facilities, you need to provide, need to maintain those facilities, just, so, you may not be able to say that, this money should be spent immediately on adding another police officer now that we have this other part. If you want to say, some probably capital facilities that, the maintenance staffing, this public safety staffing, should be commensurate with as we add more facilities that need maintenance and sense of security and staffing should reflect, the adequate levels of service on those new facilities. Reducing crime and collisions in our community, crime prevention, residential information, and so she's keying into some community services policies there in terms of crime prevention, so we can just touch on that. And quality service and innovation. Go ahead.
I was gonna say for collision loss, there's maybe an impact for transportation.
Transportation, right? So some traffic calming, or something like that.
Especially with this new corridor that's essentially be built.
Looking for transportation. Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah, here.
Yes, so some of the colors here.
Yeah. It's,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, so what was that last point?
Traffic calming and
Traffic
transportation.
calming,
To the community,
A lot of these.
a lot of community.
Yeah. Community services. Capital facility. Capital facility. Sure. Capital.
Oh, I
EVs, is that utilities too?
Yeah. So that's, okay.
and we talked, apparently there was a question about, meetings with business owners, so you could tie in economic development to your crime prevention. Anybody else see anything very highlight?
Some utility for the EVs. Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
The infrastructure for the municipal, capital. facilities.
sure.
No, it's already on there.
Yeah.
Environmental quality for the EVs.
So we move on to public works then. Touch on all these and we come back if something occurs to you. Maybe once it's already done, so. Sam, Melissa, you want to talk about that?
Everybody first.
Yeah.
Okay.
Chime in where I'm also marked. So it was a very preliminary discussion, but we met with Jeff and the the areas. So in environmental, he said a big thing that they do and they have to hire a consultant for is kind of checking all the stormwater traps for compliance with the NPEDS requirements. So that's an area where they wish they could do more on kind of water, kind of discharge quality, but that's the most they can do with the resources they have. Checking all those catch basins every 2 years. And then later, kind of on kind of drainage and sewer and wastewater, there was a talk of, we had kind of pivoted the conversation to, if we did have more density to accommodate these state ordinances, you know, do we think our existing kind of drainage facilities would be up to par? And there was a concern that maybe there would need to be some upgrades because they were all kind of designed, especially in some parts of the city, for really low level density and single family homes. In the area of community services, he said that the department's main focus is on traffic flow. So certainly has a role there, and they talked about work that would be, he talked about work that would be happening on Ballinger. Folks put in a traffic circle at that one intersection, was it at 40th? But then looking at kind of the flow on Ballinger and the main arterials of the city. In the area of capital facilities, he just said generally, many of the facilities are aging and do need maintenance and replacement that needs to be planned for. And that's also where he talked about the culvert replacements under Ballinger. That's what it was about. But specifically for goals, one of his first goals was really developing and deploying an asset management program for the whole city, which would inform kind of understanding what capital facilities need to be replaced and for maintained and on what schedule. For parks, he said there is a near-term goal in the upcoming years of developing a parks master plan, which would include documenting them all, promoting access to all of them, and addressing safety considerations, kind of going to and from the parks, which kind of connects with some of the things under the Park and Recreation Board that we were talking about. For utilities, there's also some connections here. Some of the topics we've been talking about, he said there isn't much provided directly by the city, but his department is looking into the feasibility of solar power for municipal buildings, specifically City Hall. There's a lot of coordination with SPU that needs to happen on that, and we can also be looking for grants to fund it. And they may also explore, didn't sound like they're currently exploring, but may also explore electric vehicle charging capabilities perhaps at City Hall. And then the only other kind of main goal, he said, in the near term is really developing some master plans for our sewer and stormwater systems, which he thinks needs to be done. So I think, and the only other thing that he said on that conversation on increased density, if we had it in some of our more residential neighborhoods, is, you know, he said, you know, one of the considerations is because we don't have a lot of sidewalks, there could be some capital improvements needed for transportation. And it's not easy to put in sidewalks in a lot of places because we have so many drainage ditches that would need to also be culverted or addressed in order to put in sidewalks. So something else just to think of as we're balancing kind of mandates for accommodating increased density in comprehensive master plan.
Just one point about those ditches, because we have one outside our house, actually, that's actually been, it's actually considered waters of the US, of the United States. So it's not just a ditch, it's actually waters of the US, of the United States. There's a different term for it, but
Yeah,
basically.
I think
it's
more
possible
state.
that latest US Supreme Court decision did away with that.
Well, that's, actually, that's a good point, yes.
Well, yeah, but essentially what's happening, it runs all the time, it's run continuously.
It doesn't actually, but
But there are times it's sunny outside, it's still running.
Yeah, yeah.
It's an ephemeral stream. It's
Yeah,
running through the ditch.
yeah.
Yeah, we have buffers around some of these things when development occurs, because you know, that we find out that it is a, you know, a stream that's going to be a tree connected.
As Councilmember Bobby said, it's maybe a moot point at this point.
It's okay to include it in our comprehensive plan.
Dave's culvert.
Right?
You guys want to start populating?
They're kind of hard.
Big one, you guys have a big one.
Yeah.
Utilities at the bottom.
Yeah, chief or top flow.
You ran out of utilities.
A lot of utilities.
Yeah.
Alright.
Do you have any parks? What's left?
Yeah. Transportation. Yeah, but that's something down in the middle.
I feel like economic development encompasses all of that.
Yeah.
What else do you need?
Economic development through, just capital. Growth.
Public sidewalks too.
Yeah, land use.
Maybe an environmental quality on the top, look at the storm concern, detect trade.
Oh, yeah, it's true.
Just verbally like.
Also down here with drainage, and then we want to. Oh, yeah. I was like, what? Like community services over here with. I know the power of the pen.
We have capital facilities over here for
Capital facilities. I never.
Oh.
Sleep at the wheel.
been on that.
Ready, anything else there?
You put capital facilities up at the storm. And
How would safety with the traffic flow?
put utilities up by the. Anything, or yeah, you get it. It's all overlapping now, so.
Yeah, that's a big one too. Public safety, is there, it's got public safety,
That's one thing we're gonna talk about,
yeah.
changing
It's
the
under
name.
community services.
Yeah.
I have one. here.
Yeah, that's.
I'm like,
That's a really good call.
What do we call it?
Under community services
Yeah,
/ public safety.
yeah, let's-
I put more, I guess that's.
Further out the keyboard. Okay, just caveat before I sure about the tree board. I haven't talked to the chair since April. So a lot of this information is somewhat dated perhaps. From as far as I can tell, the tree board has not been very active for probably a year. However, what I do know is at the forefront of their thinking is, you know, this plan bringing down 500 trees or more for the, project, for the, sound transit project. And if that's not at the forefront of their thoughts, then it should be. And, to your recommendation, I did reach out to them, make that
It
suggestion.
is not, it is definitely now, if it wasn't before at the forefront of their
Yeah.
thoughts, so that's helpful, and they've made some very useful suggestions
Okay.
for the tree ordinance that the council has incorporated, so
Uh-huh.
very helpful. Thank you.
So this is tree ordinances from perhaps 2 years ago that we made recommendations, I would think.
No,
or the-
there are new ones.
They're
just
new? Okay.
Connected to the,
Okay,
Council adopted
Yeah.
some of those previous ones.
okay,
Yeah.
okay. Right, okay, I'll have to review what those were because I don't know if they're.
there was
So-
a draft on the, again, on the Thursday agenda, so you could take a look at the latest.
Okay, okay. So yes, I did reach out to Mr. Olson, again, I hear back from him, so I couldn't update this report. But again, I think that what's at the forefront is that, they recently, well, actually, the city recently did a tree inventory. And so I'm not sure what the outcome of that tree inventory is,
Still working.
still working on it, yeah.
Yeah,
I think that there's some information that will come out of that tree inventory that would be useful for determining, what might be the action steps on that inventory. When we did do a canopy study a couple years ago, it was determined that by the consultant that the tree canopy in Lake Forest Park had actually grown. It hadn't actually decreased like a lot of people had feared. And however, the impact of the, I would put up there the impact, what's at the forefront is the impact of the sound transit. Impact of, removing trees, and how will that impact the canopy? I think, there's been conversations with the tree board about the economic impact of, how can you monetize a tree canopy? Let's see, well, it's some interesting things,
Tree equity,
The tree equities.
great
yeah,
conversation.
yes.
Is that, how would you fund the trees?
How would you fund the trees?
Like the trees that they're proposing to give the.
Oh,
tree
there's
equity?
grants. Well, tree equity would be a whole, I mean, there's lots of research being done about, there's certain areas in this country where, you see the income level is much lower in areas where there are no trees versus an area like Lake Forest Park. There are, there's a canopy here. And the question is, how do we protect that canopy, and then how do we share that, in that equity? So I do know that there's lots of grants that help communities expand their vegetation. Okay, yeah, not that Lake Forest Park necessarily needs that, but and then there was Stephen, Councilmember Brody, you might have more of an idea what's the things that the tree board has been thinking about in the last couple months, given conversations.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that they've spent most recent meetings, they have been talking about, what coming together with some recommendations for these changes we're making to the code. But we've also consulted about the fact that the inventory was more challenging than we thought, because the whole idea was the tree inventory was to go back places where there had been inventoried in 2010. We do two kinds of tree inventory. One is just like based on aerial photographs, what's changed, and the other one is based on a random sample. And that's what we're doing right now. It's this follow-up to it's called an iTree inventory. It's a software that's been developed so that you take this information about these random sites, and it tells you something, bigger about the canopy overall. But it tells you more than just the aerial based one, because people are actually going down there out there and saying, well, that's an oak tree and it's this big around. And so that would be really cool if we could go back to all those same sites and say, well, that oak tree now is, this much bigger, or it actually died.
That was the vision.
Right, so it's, we're still gonna be able to do some of that, but people are just not really into having other people come on the
Right.
property and measure their trees. And, I mean, it's amazing what 12 years does for people's attitudes. Because before, I think it was more, a little more homegrown, and people knew the tree board better. Our consultant was actually living in the city,
Mhm.
and he moved several years ago. So so hopefully we'll get that information out of the kind of information. We had to add some new sites to do that, but that's been one of the things the tree board has been checking back in on and helping us come up with a kind of a plan B on that. But I think they're always very, their whole reason for being was kind of to help work on what needs to change in our tree regulations to based on what's happening with our canopy stuff.
So one interesting aspect, I think, of the tree ordinance that the council discussed on Thursday is that to the extent there aren't enough trees that can be planted in the corridor itself,
Mhm.
because even like the plantings on private property have to have the approval of the homeowner, right? So, and that then we would actually get some hopefully hefty contribution of funds, taking into account the fact that when you plant a tree, it might take 30 years to reach the state of the previous tree, right? So that was some of the discussion the council had. And then the funds would actually funnel through the King Conservation District. And there would be some priorities for low tree areas of the city. So like southeast, right? Is an example of the location. So, and then the other considerations that came up in comments to the council were, don't plant such tall trees, right? You block views.
Mhm.
Fine, plant trees. But where you have views, potential views, keep the height, within reason. So that's a recap. But I think the idea of using the third party King Conservation District was actually something that the council was a positive way. And I think we got that idea from the city of Shoreline.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's something that they have done with success. So, and recently, so.
Mhm.
I don't know if you need to add anything there. I'm just giving you some background.
Basically.
Can we discuss it all, like tree health?
Yes, as a matter of fact, they've spearheaded several projects for removing ivy, because ivy's been determined as one of the biggest detriments to the tree canopy. So that's just an example of one of the things that they've been. One person in particular has been very involved in it with the tree board.
Councilmember Cassover keeps bringing up also that trees have a life. And, not every big wood maple is gonna last. And so how do you take that into account? And also, if the nature of the tree survival is gonna change in the face of climate change, how do we think about taking that into account? So we could maybe have some general statements on that in policies, but I don't know that we'll know the solution. But we've identified the issue that we should, be taken into account, because what if more of a particular kind of tree throughout the city is eventually not going to survive well?
Which is likely.
Which is likely, yes, because everything's pushing north,
There's also been, when I was part of the tree board, there were some fascinating conversations around really looking at the stands of trees versus just a single tree. because stanza trees, with the new research, that fungi, there's the health of the environment, of the ecosystem beneath the trees, and the stand trees, it's much more healthy than a single tree.
That is one of the issues they're dealing with, is the groups of trees as opposed to just looking one tree by itself.
I know they're looking at like more trees, but have they also looked at like overcrowding of trees?
I think that would be less of a concern than the trees being brought down. I don't know that. I mean,
There are times when you want to thin trees.
Yeah.
So that the dominant trees are healthier. So I don't know that they've gotten into that. That's more like forest management.
yeah, exactly.
But we're forests, so.
Yeah, that's true.
But the-
Like forest.
But the conversations that they have had is like, for some of these elderly people who have all these trees in their backyards, they can't afford to maintain them. So they're afraid that these large trees are gonna come down on homes, and, there's fear out there that these trees, yes, we love our trees, but we're also fearful of these trees. And so I think there's a balance that and when we're talking about trees, that needs to be met.
Looks like there's a lot of environmental quality
Yeah.
updates.
You have enough up there? Need more?
The last time.
But it also impacts stormwater, it impacts, which I guess, well.
Need another transportation. Oh, I don't want it. Like, you want to use mine? No, that's, I just want that better. On utilities. With roots, and that's what I think, and trees, stormwater, yeah. Land use should be up there somewhere too. Land
Yeah,
use,
that's it.
yeah.
I put housing there, because it's. I'd also put economic development out there.
Yeah, that's not- Another transportation apply this non. That's what I was saying. Yeah. So I was asked, anywhere else? I put that one down. Like the entire comp plan is out on.
Yeah, well, that's especially where something like that where it affects all the areas. So and that's really, I think, the message out of this is you really just can't. You just got to be looking at everything and thinking about number one, if we're going to have this redundancy, is the redundancy consistent throughout the plan, or are we like can somebody just kind of pick and choose the policy they want to. So you really have to be, you're going to be the reviewers of the work of the consultant. And so, you can never just assume that they're doing all that sort of cross element review. That's really where you can add value to the process, because you've already been looking at this stuff and you've been thinking about, well, okay, well, if we're really going to be, thinking about, helping homeowners, maintain their tree canopy, both for safety and for environmental value. Maybe that gets into community service sometimes. We need to be kind of thinking about that, and what are the things that, not only there are programs to help people do renovations to their houses, why aren't there programs to help people maintain their trees? It's like every week we've got my neighbor's tree is scaring me to death. It's like, so few. So, and that would be a great service if we can figure that out, and we, just highlight that part of this is like the city should be looking into this as a way to, because when you don't do something like that, what happens is these tree services go around all over the city saying, that tree looks a little dangerous, we want to take that out, and so we end up losing trees that are not, really that, important to remove. Whereas if we had a more of a grassroots, or that you knew that you could help, I'm worried about these trees in my backyard that nobody can see, so those are those kind of crossover things that hopefully this kind of helps you sort of think about that the plan as a a larger, or the things that are going to overlap. So appreciate you guys playing along.
One of the things I am seeing missing, though I don't know where this would fit in, but it's the missing middle discussion that we've had. I feel like it's kind of absent in this discussion. Like you guys,
Similar. Missing
so I gotta speak to the missing middle for the housing component.
of the house.
Yeah, so, I know we just finished the ADUs to address that, but I just am not seeing that in this discussion is.
Well, it's
Yeah.
it's sort of the elephant in the room. We know that there's new state legislation.
Right,
It's
exactly.
like on the top of our list in our proposed scope of work. Like the big chunk of it would be a housing needs assessment. What do we need to do on that? So I think with this exercise, we're trying to pick up on things that maybe aren't at the forefront of the thinking of sort of what the planning department's thinking about, and what we've heard a lot of news about. It's these things that like this idea of the canopy equity. That's coming from inside. It's kind of a new idea that well, it's always been a problem out there, but we never really put a name on that. And I think that's really helpful. It's like, so we have a shorthand, canopy equity. We can make these big projects. We can leverage big projects like Sound Transit to create more canopy equity by getting trees in those areas that don't have many trees.
But there is some state legislation that passed, not all of it passed. And so I think it would be good to take our legislative update on the housing component and share it. But I think there was concern that we would be stuck with Seattle standards because we're contiguous, but I think that part doesn't bind us anymore. So we're covered by the cities under 25,000. This is what I think, but I am still confused when I read the legislation. And so for those cities, single family lots have to be duplexed, right? And then the transit oriented development one, which was going to increase that within a half mile or some distance of a major transit route, whether bus or light rail, that didn't pass. So it seems like we'll have a transition, and then also I think ADUs count, right?
Right. Yeah. So
Yes, so as the second unit, so I think the complexities are, so, are you still, do you get to sell the units separately, kind of almost condominiumize them. You know, and there are some unresolved issues, but I think at least giving you what our lobbyists just shared with us on the legislative update, there were something like 12 missing middle bills introduced, or maybe more, maybe 24. But anyway, so it's not as bad as the worst case proposals that we were seeing.
Yeah, I think you're, that's my understanding too. It's to basically, 2 units per lot, single families need to be allowed. And if you allow duplexes on all single family lots, if you don't yet, then you can see a check for compliance. But the even better news is that we have until we adopt the comprehensive plan to be in compliance. So we'll get the benefit of whatever ordinances come out, understanding and then, they'll write procedural rules for, how these RCWs have to be interpreted. So we'll get some clarity. Those very issues. Do we have to allow condominiums on single family?
To remind you on the housing needs assessment, and I think how this new dual units on single family lots, how that fits in, I think will be interesting. But on the housing needs assessment, if you look at our previous Growth Management Act targets, we had sufficient zoning already to meet those. And so it's good to be in that position, right? To when you start your housing needs assessment. I think also overall, at least when I looked into this about a year and a half ago, our rents are overall lower than other jurisdictions. So we do have quite a few apartment buildings. They're just kind of hidden by bushes and trees, but we have quite a few. So, and we have one on King County Housing Authority apartment building. So overall, I think our housing needs assessment is gonna, for a city our size especially, is gonna turn out pretty positive and not drastic like some of the statistics and stuff here for the region as a whole.
Yeah, so we'll definitely cover.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a big area with
Yeah.
being a consultant. Is like, what is your understanding of legislation? And then the public outreach is really important because we want to do this in a way that's not going to bring people like think unglued about them.
Yeah, no, thanks for, I just want to make sure that that we are in compliance, that everything, yeah, and I guess it's fully appropriate for that. That's all that we're going for.
You want to talk about this whole thing? Oh,
Well,
Yeah.
before we do that though, can we come back to how we're going to use this information? I assume that it's being typed up.
Yeah, I
Should take
thought we
photos.
could just take photos of it and Nick can insert them into the notes as well as create something. After we have Nick's notes and these photos, we can kind of create like a little report. That would say here's what came out of that discussion. Maybe sort of summarize some of the ideas, just how we went through the process. Appreciate it. If there's not anything else, we'll figure out a way to pull this together into something that you can use to sort of refresh your mind. And maybe the notes do it because we put it all together, and then see if you think there's a need to just do something more with it to make it really easily understood by whoever. In terms of, so you want to go on and just talk a brief update on the consulting process. So the mayor appointed a selection committee that includes Maddie, your chair, and your vice chair, and a council member, Tracy Fuertani. And so they're looking at the 4 proposals, not proposals, they're statements of qualifications that came in saying, here's how we would, here's why we think we're the best, to do the project as we understand it. And so we're going to develop a short list, and then hopefully on that one day where I go on vacation, June 30th, we can get interviewed.
Wanna write that down.
So maybe, you know,
Block that date out.
keep that date open.
Yeah, give him a list of all the things I can't do.
Oh,
Yeah,
Very-
it was the day before the last day, I think.
Yeah.
The 29th.
29th, yeah.
Yeah, and so yeah, so we'll hopefully, I think it's gonna be fairly easy to get down to the top two. I don't know how you're feeling is yet, but and then we'll interview those and then hopefully be able to negotiate a contract and bring it to council sometime in July. So it may make sense to postpone your meeting in July anyway. So I was thinking as we were talking about that, just so we maybe get that much closer to actually having a consultant on board. See how that plays out.
So there were 4 submissions.
Yes.
well, that's good.
4 submissions, 2 of them that I'm familiar with. The other 2 are I never heard of. One of them definitely out of state. The other one was a smaller firm. One of the state.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like a picture of the face.
Yeah.
But they had work, they had a relevant options.
Oh, did they?
They did, yeah. They seemed a little bit newer, which probably explains why you're not
Yeah.
familiar with them.
Right.
How do you feel about the fact that we got 4? Do you feel that that's good? Do you,
Oh, that's pretty typical.
is that
I
line?
mean, I would have hoped that it would have been, the majority of them, I would have, heard of it, have known their work. So that, but, in today's climate, I mean, there have been RFPs put out, that we got no response on their public works stuff. It's engineers, especially. So I didn't know kind of, planning, consultants were getting that way. So I'm really pleased. We have 2 consultants that we know they have good track record, and then maybe a 3rd one that we can look at more closely if we need to.
Yeah, and I think too, just for the good of the order, you guys put together a really document for that too, is really straightforward. There's not a ton of fluff. So yeah, it was easy to read, even the one that was down backwards. That was kind of confusing. That was interesting, but
Wait, their proposal was down there?
yeah.
Yeah, it was like, it turned
Yeah,
out,
no,
it turned out not only did
That's
they,
pretty good.
it wasn't just electronically sent it to Staples. And then the front desk person said, yeah, and it was delivered by a DoorDash guy or something. Instacart, an Instacart guy.
I mean,
So they never saw it after it got finished.
yeah.
Mistakes happen.
Anyway, so that's kind of the report. Any questions?
When would you foresee a decision? So if the interview's on 30th, then do we reconvene after all the interviews, talk, and then?
We would do that the same
Same day.
day, just kind of go through the same process, just in person, which one's rising to the top. So you talk to them and look at the proposal. And then you see if there's a consensus in the group. Usually, yeah, I mean, sometimes you do have enough submittals that you go through a second interview with the top 2 choices. But that is the one you're thinking about, not having too many responses to deal with.
Yeah. Great. Any other questions on that? We want to talk about new business, election of planning and commission, the planning commission chair.
Yeah, I this is not a must do, and I wonder if you want to wait until more folks are here, especially the chair, and maybe, and we may have a new, that's the other news is that Walter has officially resigned from the commission. He's moved out of town. He's not living here permanently. He's part-time resident. So the mayor would really like to get somebody in who's going to be able to focus more on the project. So we have a couple of candidates that we've interviewed, and we're just kind of waiting to see what Walter was going to do. And so it looks like we'll be able to fill one of those. And then if we decide, the mayor's adopted, the council adopted the mayor's recommended ordinance to create alternates. So we could have someone who's just kind of sits in in meetings, but doesn't, isn't a voting member, but you know, in case some position, someone has to go off the commission, they're all ready to go and up to speed. So we might have an alternate as well.
Great. So we'll hold on the election, so we have more folks. Reports and announcements. That kind of falls under your
I think we're
announcements.
exhausted.
Okay. Agenda for next meeting.
Yes, hopefully it's a kickoff of with the discussion with the consultant. But just touch base with you and or Patty and let me know about what's coming together and whether it makes sense to maybe postpone the meeting to later in the month.
Mhm. Great. Well, it sounds like we have a couple conflicts too, so I want to do that
Yeah.
anyway. Huh? Okay. Great. Anybody have any other comments or entertain a motion to adjourn?
There's no one on.
Oh, great call. I thought I did hear the buzz. There's two.
Yeah, that was just me joining the meeting. So I
Oh,
could
is
hear
it?
this connection.
I just want to say what a good meeting. Very impressive. Yeah, it's like the start of the real comprehensive planning, I feel, you know, like so. And the thoughts of how things fit together and what the issues are. It's really, really great.
I think Lois was a really driving proponent for that.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's have you back, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see what
There's a
you do.
pizza too.
Yeah. That's very nice.
Big kudos for pizza.
Oh, yeah.
I know pizza.
Yeah.
No matter what.
we should get some home, yeah.
Great. Well, there a motion to adjourn.
With that, I'll move to adjourn the meeting tonight.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Sounds good.
Thanks, everybody.
Nice work,
Yeah.
Sharon, there.
Yeah.
Good job.
Like a
I'm sure knows too.
It's good, you didn't have time to get nervous about it.
Oh, yeah.
You just, in the mood, in the moment.
Right here.